In forgotten deserts, deep forests, mountain passes, and abandoned industrial valleys, there are railways that seem to lead nowhere. Their tracks disappear into empty landscapes. Their stations stand silent. Their bridges cross rivers that no longer carry freight. Rusting locomotives sit beneath collapsing roofs, while weeds grow between rails that once carried the weight of entire economies. To most people, these abandoned railways look like relics of a vanished age, failed businesses, outdated technology, industrial ruins left behind by progress. But many of these railways were never really about transportation. They were labor systems, control systems, extraction systems, and in some places, entire generations spent their lives trapped inside them. The tracks connected mines to ports, plantations to factories, forests to sawmills, industrial towns to global markets. Every mile of rail solved a problem that governments, investors, and industries desperately needed solved. How do you move coal from isolated mountains? How do you transport nitrate from deserts where almost nobody can survive? How do you feed growing cities hundreds of miles away? How do you supply factories that consume raw materials faster than nature can provide them? For the industrial world, railways became the answer. They conquered distance, they reduced costs, they expanded empires, and they transformed remote landscapes into engines of wealth. But the wealth rarely stayed where it was created. The money flowed outward. The resources flowed outward. The products flowed outward. The workers remained. Entire communities emerged around railway systems that existed for a single purpose: to keep materials moving. When the trains arrived, jobs appeared. When the jobs appeared, towns grew. When towns grew, families settled. And when families settled, dependence followed. Soon entire regions depended on rail lines they did not own, industries they did not control, and employers they could not escape. The railway became the center of life. It determined where people lived, what they earned, what they bought, who held power, and whether a community survived another year. In some industrial regions, workers could spend decades living inside company-controlled systems linked together by rail. Their housing, wages, food supplies, transportation, and employment all depended on tracks stretching across landscapes most outsiders never saw. The railway delivered opportunity, but it also delivered isolation, and sometimes exploitation, because every industrial system contains a contradiction. The larger it grows, the more people depend upon it. The more people depend upon it, the harder it becomes to leave. And the harder it becomes to leave, the greater the human cost when the system begins to fail. Today, many of these networks have vanished. The trains are gone. The industries are gone. The workers who built them are long dead. Yet the evidence remains scattered across continents: abandoned depots, collapsed company towns, desert locomotives frozen in place, tracks leading into landscapes that no longer produce what they once carried. Together, these ruins tell a story far larger than transportation. They tell the story of how industrial civilization solved one of its greatest problems: moving enormous quantities of material across impossible distances. But they also reveal a darker question. If these railways created such extraordinary wealth, why did so many of the people who built, operated, and depended on them remain trapped inside the very systems that made empires rich? To answer that question, we have to go back to a time before the rails existed, when distance itself was one of the greatest obstacles industrial society had ever faced. Welcome to History Forged. This channel explores the rise of industry, the evolution of engineering, and the people who worked inside the world's most powerful machines. We cover steel production, railways, infrastructure, industrial disasters, manufacturing systems, and the technologies that transformed civilization. If that sounds interesting, subscribe and join us for more industrial history and engineering documentaries. Long before the railway became a symbol of industrial power, Distance was one of the greatest limitations on human civilization. Not technology, not labor, not resources, distance. The modern world often creates the illusion that geography no longer matters. Raw materials move across oceans, food travels between continents. Products manufactured in one hemisphere appear on store shelves in another within weeks. But before industrial transportation networks emerged, every mile mattered. Every river crossing mattered. Every mountain mattered. Every stretch of desert mattered. The world possessed enormous wealth beneath its soil, hidden within forests, buried inside mountains, and scattered across vast landscapes. Yet much of that wealth remained inaccessible because moving it was often more expensive than extracting it. A rich coal deposit had little value if it sat hundreds of miles from the factories that needed fuel. A productive forest meant little if timber could not reach construction markets. A mineral deposit might be scientifically valuable, yet economically useless, if transportation costs exceeded its market price. The challenge was not finding resources. The challenge was moving them. For centuries, water had been the preferred solution. Rivers functioned as natural highways. Canals expanded transportation capacity. Coastal shipping connected major settlements. Where water existed, commerce followed. Where water did not exist, economic growth slowed dramatically. Entire regions remained isolated simply because geography refused to cooperate. Then came industrialization. And industrialization changed everything. Factories consumed materials at unprecedented rates. Steam engines demanded fuel. Steel production required iron ore and coal. Growing cities required food, lumber, stone, and manufactured goods. The scale of consumption expanded faster than traditional transportation systems could handle. A village economy might survive on wagon roads. An industrial economy could not. Suddenly governments, industrialists, investors, and engineers all faced the same problem. How could enormous quantities of material move reliably across vast distances regardless of season, terrain, or weather? The question appeared everywhere. In Britain, coal fields needed connections to industrial cities. In North America, agricultural regions required access to eastern markets. In South America, mineral wealth sat trapped behind deserts and mountains. Across Africa, Asia, and Australia, colonial powers sought methods for extracting resources from territories separated by immense geographic barriers. The industrial age was creating demand faster than transportation systems could satisfy it. And demand created pressure. Pressure created innovation. Innovation created infrastructure. But before rails crossed continents, another transportation system carried the burden: the wagon. Thousands upon thousands of wagons. Drawn by horses, mules, oxen, or combinations of animals, these vehicles became the backbone of pre-industrial logistics, yet they suffered from fundamental limitations. Roads turned to mud. Bridges collapsed. Animals became exhausted. Cargo capacity remained small. Travel times remained slow. Cost remained high. A factory waiting for coal could not simply accelerate a wagon train. A city experiencing food shortages could not instantly increase transport capacity. Physical limitations governed every aspect of movement. As industrial demand expanded, these limitations became increasingly destructive. Production slowed. Markets remained disconnected. Resource development stalled. Opportunities disappeared. Investors looked at distant deposits and saw potential profits trapped behind transportation barriers. Governments looked at undeveloped regions and saw untapped economic power. Engineers looked at the same landscapes and saw problems waiting to be solved. The solution would require something more permanent than roads, something stronger than wagon routes, something capable of moving unprecedented quantities of cargo at predictable costs. Yet the transportation challenge involved more than economics. It involved power, control, influence, because whoever controlled transportation controlled access. A mine owner depended on transportation. A farmer depended on transportation. A manufacturer depended on transportation. Cities depended on transportation. Nations depended on transportation. The ability to move resources increasingly determined who prospered and who fell behind. This reality became especially visible in remote industrial frontiers. Take a mining region hundreds of miles from the nearest port. Workers might successfully extract valuable materials. Engineers might develop efficient production systems. Investors might provide financing. But none of it mattered if the product remained stranded. Every ton left at the mine represented lost income. Every delay reduced competitiveness. Every transportation bottleneck threatened profitability. Again and again, industrial projects encountered the same obstacle. The resource existed. The market existed. The labor existed. The transportation system did not. As the 19th century progressed, industrial societies became increasingly obsessed with overcoming this barrier. Governments funded surveys. Investors financed ambitious proposals. Engineers studied terrain once considered impossible. Mountains that had blocked movement for centuries became engineering challenges. Deserts became logistical puzzles. Forests became corridors waiting to be opened. Entire professions emerged around the question of how to connect production with consumption. The stakes were enormous, because transportation no longer affected only individual businesses. It affected national economies. Countries capable of moving resources efficiently gained industrial advantages. Countries unable to do so risked economic stagnation. Transportation's infrastructure became a strategic asset, sometimes even a weapon. Yet amid discussions of economics, engineering, and national development, another reality received far less attention. The people who would build these systems. Surveyors entered dangerous wilderness. Construction crews crossed deserts and mountains. Laborers blasted tunnels through rock. Bridge workers balanced above rivers and canyons. Track gangs laid rails across landscapes few outsiders would ever visit. The future transportation network existed first as human labor. Every mile required sacrifice. Every bridge required risk. Every tunnel required lives. But in the early stages, those costs remained largely invisible. The focus remained fixed on what the new systems might accomplish: cheaper transport, greater production, economic expansion, industrial growth. The promises seemed limitless. And because the promises seemed limitless, investors poured money into increasingly ambitious railway schemes. Some projects appeared irrational. Others appeared impossible. Yet year after year, new proposals emerged. Lines stretching across deserts, lines crossing mountains, lines penetrating forests, lines connecting mines, ports, plantations, factories, and cities. What began as a transportation solution gradually evolved into something much larger. The railway would not simply move goods. It would reorganize entire economies. It would reshape landscapes. It would determine where communities emerged and where they disappeared. Most importantly, it would create industrial systems so powerful that generations of workers would eventually find their lives revolving around tracks they neither owned nor controlled. The age of distance was ending. The age of rail was about to begin. And with it came an explosion of opportunity, wealth, and industrial growth that few people fully understood. What even fewer understood was the price that growth would eventually demand. The first railways were not designed to build empires. They were designed to solve local problems. That fact is easy to forget today. Looking back from the modern world, rail networks appear inevitable. Maps show lines spreading across continents as though history followed a predetermined path. It is tempting to imagine governments and industrialists fully understanding what railways would become. They did not. At first, most people saw railways as specialized tools, useful, promising, but limited. Early rail systems often connected a single mine to a nearby river, a quarry to a canal, or an industrial site to a port. Their purpose was straightforward: reduce transportation costs and move heavier loads than animal-powered wagons could manage. Yet something unusual happened. The more railways succeeded, the larger the problems people expected them to solve. A line built to connect one mine inspired another. A successful freight route encouraged expansion. Every reduction in transport costs created opportunities that previously seemed impossible. Industries began growing around railways faster than railways grew around industries. Investors noticed first. Railroads did something few industrial projects could accomplish. They generated value beyond their immediate function. A railway serving a coal field increased coal production. Increased coal production supplied factories. Factories stimulated urban growth. Urban growth expanded markets. Expanded markets created new demand for transportation. One rail line often justified another. The system fed itself. What started as infrastructure gradually became an engine of economic multiplication. Money followed accordingly. Throughout the 19th century, railway construction attracted enormous investment. Governments provided support. Private financiers purchased shares. Foreign capital crossed borders seeking opportunities. Railway companies became some of the most influential institutions of the industrial age. For many investors, railways represented more than transportation. They represented the future itself. The logic seemed irresistible. Where tracks appeared, economic activity followed. Where economic activity followed, profits emerged. And wherever profits emerged, additional expansion became easier to justify. Soon railways were no longer connecting individual sites. They were connecting regions, then nations, then continents. In industrial centers, railroads linked coal fields to steel mills, factories to ports, and cities to resource frontiers. In agricultural regions, they connected farms to distant markets. In colonial territories, they connected extraction zones to export terminals. Across the world, the same pattern repeated. The railway arrived, production increased, settlements expanded, dependence followed. Yet expansion was not driven solely by economics. Railways also transformed political power. Governments quickly recognized that transportation infrastructure could strengthen national control. Remote territories became easier to administer. Military forces could move more rapidly. Communication improved. Economic integration accelerated. Regions once separated by geography became linked through transportation networks. For emerging nation-states, railways offered a means of unification. For empires, they offered a means of extraction. And often those goals overlapped. A railway promoted as national development might simultaneously function as an industrial supply route. A line advertised as progress might primarily serve investors exporting raw materials. A community might welcome the arrival of tracks, only to discover that local needs ranked far below industrial priorities. The railway connected people, but it connected resources first. This distinction would shape countless lives. Consider what happened when railways reached remote industrial frontiers. Before the tracks arrived, many resource-rich regions remained sparsely populated. The challenges were simply too great. Isolation discouraged settlement. Transportation costs discouraged investment. Economic activity remained limited. Railways changed that equation almost overnight. A mining district that had once been inaccessible suddenly became profitable. A forest once considered too remote became commercially valuable. Agricultural land previously isolated from markets became productive. Entire towns emerged where almost nothing had existed before. Surveyors marked routes. Engineers established depots. Construction camps appeared. Workers arrived. Merchants followed. Families settled. Schools opened. Hospitals emerged. Churches were built. Within years, landscapes transformed. Many of these communities existed because of a single transportation corridor. Their prosperity depended on continued movement along the tracks. Without trains, the local economy often had no reason to exist. That dependence created vulnerabilities few people initially recognized. But during the expansion phase, optimism overwhelmed caution. The railways seemed unstoppable. New engineering achievements fueled this confidence. Mountain ranges that had once blocked transportation yielded to tunnels and bridges. Deserts were crossed through elaborate logistical systems. Forests were cut open by construction crews advancing mile after mile. Engineers developed increasingly sophisticated methods for overcoming natural obstacles. Every successful project expanded the industry's reputation. Investors became bolder. Governments became more ambitious. Railway companies became larger. Soon competition emerged. Different companies raced to control strategic routes. Ports competed for access. Cities fought to attract connections. Industrial regions lobbied for service. Transportation networks became economic battlegrounds. The rewards could be enormous. A town connected to a major rail line might flourish. A town bypassed by the same line might decline. Businesses relocated. Population shifted. Investment concentrated around transportation corridors. The railway did not merely serve economic geography. It rewrote it. And nowhere was this transformation more dramatic than in resource extraction. Industries: coal, iron, copper, timber, nitrate, cotton, grain. Countless commodities became economically viable only because rail transport reduced costs enough to make large-scale extraction profitable. The relationship worked both ways. Industries depended on railways. Railways depended on industrial cargo. Together they formed integrated systems. The tracks required freight. The freight required tracks. Neither could easily survive without the other. As these systems matured, another trend emerged. Workers increasingly found themselves living inside railway-dependent economies. Employment centered on extraction industries. Extraction industries centered on transportation infrastructure. Transportation infrastructure centered on corporate ownership. The result was a new kind of industrial landscape. Company towns multiplied. Employer-controlled housing expanded. Local commerce often revolved around a single industry. Entire populations became economically tied to transportation networks they could not influence. At first, this arrangement appeared beneficial. Jobs were available. Wages arrived regularly. Communities grew. Industrial development created opportunities that previous generations had never possessed. Many workers willingly relocated to railway frontiers seeking better lives. Some achieved exactly that. Others discovered that dependence carried hidden risks, because the same railway that delivered opportunity also controlled access. Access to employment, access to supplies, access to markets, sometimes even access to departure. In particularly isolated regions, workers had few alternatives. The nearest town might be dozens or hundreds of miles away. The railway became the community's connection to the outside world. Its schedules shaped daily life. Its priorities shaped local economies. Its owners held extraordinary influence. Yet, these consequences remained largely invisible beneath the excitement of expansion. Politicians celebrated development. Investors celebrated profits. Engineers celebrated technical achievements. Newspapers celebrated progress. Few people asked what would happen if entire communities became dependent upon transportation systems designed primarily to serve industrial production. Fewer still asked who would bear the burden when economic conditions changed. For the moment, growth continued. Tracks stretched farther. Freight volumes increased. Production soared. The railway age appeared triumphant. Across continents, steel rails connected mines, forests, farms, factories, and ports into vast industrial networks unlike anything humanity had ever created. But beneath the impressive statistics and engineering accomplishments, a more complicated reality was taking shape. Because building the network was one challenge, operating it was another, and maintaining the constant flow of materials, workers, equipment. Profits across thousands of miles would require an enormous human machine hidden behind the locomotives themselves. To understand the true nature of the railway system, we have to move beyond the maps and the investment reports. We have to step inside the network and see how it actually functioned. From a distance, the railway appeared simple. A locomotive, a line of freight cars, steel rails stretching toward the horizon, cargo moving from one place to another. That is the image most people remember. But the railway itself was only the visible surface of something much larger. Beneath every train existed an industrial system so vast and interconnected that entire regions depended upon its uninterrupted operation. The tracks were not the system. They were the veins. The system was everything flowing through them. To understand how railway networks built empires, it is necessary to look beyond locomotives and into the machinery of coordination that surrounded them. Because railways solved a transportation problem only by creating an organizational challenge unlike anything that had existed before. Every train had to arrive at the right place. Every shipment had to reach the correct destination. Every section of track required maintenance. Every bridge required inspection. Every locomotive required fuel repairs and crews. The larger the network became, the more complicated the system grew. A single failure could ripple across hundreds of miles. A damaged bridge could interrupt freight movements throughout an entire region. A washed-out section of track could halt industrial production far beyond the immediate location. A mechanical breakdown might delay cargo needed by factories, ports, mines, or cities. Industrial society increasingly depended upon movement, and movement increasingly depended upon railways. This dependence created an enormous demand for labor. Not only train crews, not only engineers, thousands of people worked behind the scenes to keep the system functioning. Track workers inspected rails. Maintenance crews repaired bridges. Signal operators coordinated movements. Mechanics rebuilt locomotives. Switchmen directed freight cars. Station workers handled cargo. Dispatchers monitored traffic. Construction crews expanded routes. Telegraph operators transmitted information across vast distances. The railway required a workforce almost as extensive as the industries it served. In many regions, maintaining transportation became an industry of its own. Yet the system extended even further. The railway did not merely transport industrial production. It structured industrial production. Consider a remote mining district. At first glance, the mine might appear to be the center of activity, but the mine depended on regular deliveries, fuel, food, equipment, replacement parts, construction materials, workers. Everything arrived through transportation networks. Without reliable rail service, production could collapse. The same relationship existed in forestry operations, agricultural regions, industrial towns, port facilities. Every major component depended upon every other component. The railway became the connecting mechanism that held the entire structure together. As a result, industries began organizing themselves around transportation requirements. Production schedules aligned with freight schedules. Storage facilities expanded near rail junctions. Factories clustered around transportation corridors. Ports developed specialized infrastructure for handling rail cargo. Entire landscapes were redesigned to maximize movement. Efficiency became the guiding principle. Not comfort, not flexibility, movement. The goal was simple: keep materials flowing. The faster its resources moved, the greater the profits. The more reliable the movement, the larger the industrial system could become. Railways enabled a scale of extraction previously impossible. Coal fields expanded. Timber operations penetrated deeper into forests. Agricultural production intensified. Mining districts multiplied. Industries no longer needed to remain close to markets. Transportations reduced the penalty of distance. As long as the rails connected production to consumption, geography became less restrictive. but only less restrictive, never irrelevant. In reality, many railway systems operated in extraordinarily hostile environments. Deserts consumed equipment with heat and sand. Mountains subjected infrastructure to landslides and snow. Tropical regions accelerated corrosion and decay. Floodplains washed away tracks. Remote territories complicated maintenance. Every mile required constant attention. The farther a railway extended, the harder it became to sustain, and the people responsible for sustaining it often lived in isolation. Across the industrial world, railway settlements appeared at strategic intervals: maintenance camps, repair depots, fuel stations, water facilities, crew housing. These locations rarely attracted attention from outsiders, yet they formed the backbone of the network. Workers stationed there performed essential tasks year after year, replacing damaged rails, inspecting bridges, clearing debris, repairing storm damage, monitoring infrastructure. Without them, the railway would gradually fail. Many lived in communities defined entirely by the transportation system. The nearest major city might be hundreds of miles away. Economic opportunities outside the railway were limited. Employment often passed from one generation to the next. Fathers worked on the railway. Sons joined the railway. Entire families became linked to the network. In resource frontiers, this relationship became even stronger. Mining railways offer one of the clearest examples. A company might build tracks into an isolated region solely to move ore. Along those tracks emerged worker housing, supply depots, repair facilities, and administrative centers. Over time, what began as transportation infrastructure evolved into a complete industrial ecosystem. The railway carried ore outward. It carried necessities inward. The local economy revolved around both directions simultaneously. Everything depended on continuity. Everything depended on movement. This dependency created remarkable efficiency. It also created fragility, because integrated systems rarely fail gradually. They fail through disruption: a strike, a flood, a bridge collapse, a financial crisis, a market downturn. Any interruption threatened the larger network. Railway operators understood this reality better than anyone. As systems expanded, management became increasingly centralized, schedules grew more complex, rules became stricter, supervision intensified, efficiency demanded discipline. Delays cost money, breakdowns cost money, accidents cost money. The pressure to maintain continuous operation spread throughout the workforce. Workers often faced expectations shaped not by local conditions but by distant economic demands. A delayed shipment in one region could affect production in another. An interrupted supply line could impact investors thousands of miles away. The railway connected people who never met and industries separated by enormous distances. Its success depended upon coordinating them all. Yet perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the system was how invisible it became. Passengers saw trains. Newspapers reported construction projects. Investors discussed profits. Politicians celebrated development. But the underlying network of labor often disappeared from public attention. The maintenance worker replacing rails in a desert. The signal operator managing traffic through a storm. The bridge crew inspecting steel high above a river. The mechanic rebuilding locomotives late at night. Their work rarely appeared in official celebrations. Yet without them, the celebrated achievements would have been impossible. This invisibility extended beyond individual workers. Entire communities became hidden components of industrial systems. Maps showed tracks. Maps rarely showed dependence. Statistics recorded freight volumes. Statistics rarely recorded isolation. Economic reports measured production. Economic reports rarely measured sacrifice. And so the railway age produced a contradiction. The system generated extraordinary wealth. It connected continents. It accelerated industrial growth. It transformed economies. Yet the people closest to its daily operation often remained the least visible. The farther one moved from corporate offices and government ministries, the clearer this contradiction became. Because behind the impressive freight totals and engineering achievements stood communities whose futures depended entirely upon industries they did not control. For some, the railway brought prosperity. For others, it became a cage built from economic necessity. And nowhere was that reality more apparent than in the lives of the workers themselves. Because the greatest cost of the railway system was never measured in steel, fuel, or money. It was measured in human lives. Industrial history often remembers achievements. The tunnel completed, the bridge opened, the railway connected, the freight records broken, the production targets exceeded. What it remembers less clearly are the people who made those achievements possible. Not the investors, not the politicians, not the executives whose names appeared in newspapers, the workers, the people who blasted through mountains, the people who laid track across deserts, the people who repaired bridges in winter storms, the people who lived inside railway systems year after year because their livelihoods depended on them. For many communities, the railway represented opportunity, but opportunity and dependence often arrived together. A railway could transform an isolated region almost overnight. Jobs appeared, businesses opened, families relocated. Entire towns emerged from landscapes that had previously supported little permanent settlement. At first, the arrangement seemed beneficial. Workers earned wages, communities grew, schools appeared, medical facilities expanded, supplies became more accessible. Compared with earlier generations, many families experienced improvements in material living conditions. Yet beneath these benefits existed a difficult reality. Most railway-dependent communities possessed very little economic diversity. One industry dominated employment. One transportation network connected the town to the outside world. One employer frequently controlled the local economy. When conditions were favorable, prosperity followed. When conditions changed, vulnerability emerged. This pattern repeated across continents. Mining towns depended on ore prices. Logging communities depended on timber markets. Agricultural rail corridors depended on commodity demand. Workers often had little influence over the forces determining their futures. Decisions made in distant financial centers could reshape entire communities. A decline in market prices might reduce production. Reduced production might eliminate jobs. Job losses might trigger migration. Population decline could threaten local businesses. The process often accelerated once it began. What appeared stable could become fragile with surprising speed. Yet economic uncertainty was only one aspect of the human cost. The work itself was dangerous. Railway construction ranks among the most demanding forms of industrial labor ever undertaken. Workers crossed difficult terrain carrying heavy materials. They excavated tunnels using explosives. They erected bridges over rivers and canyons. They operated in deserts, mountains, forests, and wetlands. The environments themselves frequently posed significant risks. Heat exhaustion, exposure, disease, accidents, isolation. In many regions, medical care remained limited. Communication was slow, rescue operations were difficult. A workplace injury could become a life-altering event, sometimes a fatal one. Construction projects often demanded speed. Investors wanted returns. Governments wanted results. Railway companies faced pressure to complete routes quickly. Workers absorbed much of that pressure. Long hours became common. Safety standards varied significantly across locations and time periods. In dangerous environments, even routine tasks could carry substantial risk. A bridge crew balancing above a gorge, a blasting team operating inside a tunnel, a maintenance gang replacing damaged rails in severe weather. The railway depended upon thousands of such activities occurring continuously. Most succeeded without incident. Some did not. The consequences could be devastating, yet construction represented only the beginning. Once railways entered service, danger remained. Train crews operated powerful machinery under demanding conditions. Maintenance workers performed physically strenuous tasks. Repair personnel handled heavy equipment. Signal operators carried enormous responsibility. Mistakes could have serious consequences. Accidents involving freight trains, passenger trains, or industrial cargo sometimes affected entire communities. The railway's efficiency depended upon precision. Precision depended upon people. People inevitably made mistakes. When systems grew larger and more complex, the consequences of failure often grew larger as well. But perhaps the most enduring burden was not physical danger. It was dependence. Railway systems frequently created communities that existed because of a specific industrial purpose. Remove the purpose, and the community's future became uncertain. Many workers understood this reality. They recognized that their livelihoods relied upon forces beyond local control: commodity prices, corporate decisions, technological changes, government policies, international markets. The railway connected local lives to global systems. That connection generated opportunities. It also generated insecurity. Generations sometimes spent their entire lives within these industrial environments. Children grew up watching trains arrive and depart. Parents worked jobs tied directly to transportation and extraction. Family histories became intertwined with the fortunes of industries located hundreds or thousands of miles from final consumers. In some regions, railway employment became part of community identity. The railway was not merely an employer. It was a way of life. It shaped routines. It shaped expectations. It shaped the future. This deep integration produced strong social bonds. Workers relied upon one another. Families supported one another. Communities developed cultures rooted in shared experiences. Yet those same bonds could make change more difficult. Leaving often meant abandoning social networks, employment opportunities, and familiar surroundings simultaneously. The railway provided stability. The railway limited alternatives. This contradiction sat at the heart of many industrial communities. And then there were the workers who remained largely invisible even within the system itself. Temporary laborers, seasonal crews, track gangs assigned to remote territories, construction workers moving from project to project. Their contributions were essential. Their recognition was often limited. Many performed exhausting labor under difficult conditions and disappeared from the historical record almost entirely. The railway remembered freight tonnage. History remembered major engineering achievements. Individual workers frequently vanished from view. Yet every mile of track represented human effort. Every station reflected labor. Every bridge embodied sacrifice. The network did not build itself. People built it. People maintained it. People carried its burdens. And over time, many paid costs that extended far beyond wages and working conditions. Families relocated repeatedly following employment opportunities. Communities endured cycles of boom and decline. Workers aged in demanding occupations. Children inherited economic structures created long before they were born. The railway shaped lives across generations. That influence persisted even when prosperity faded. Because eventually, the industrial conditions that justified many railway systems began to change. New technologies emerged. Road transport improved. Market demands shifted. Track industries exhausted resources. Economic priorities evolved. The systems that once seemed permanent suddenly faced competition. Some adapted. Others struggled. Many communities assumed the railway would always remain. After all, it had been there for decades, in some cases for generations. But industrial systems are rarely immortal. They survive only as long as the problems they solve remain economically important. And when those problems change, even the most impressive infrastructure can become vulnerable. The workers who built their lives around the railway would soon discover that dependence creates one final risk. When the system declines, entire communities can decline with it. And that is exactly what happened across large portions of the industrial world. For decades, the railway seemed permanent. The tracks stretched across deserts, forests, mountains, and industrial valleys with an appearance of permanence that few questioned. Entire generations had grown up alongside them. Communities depended on them. Industries depended on them. Governments depended on them. The railway was no longer merely infrastructure. It had become part of the landscape itself, and that is precisely why its decline often came as a shock. Not because the warning signs were absent, but because the system had become so deeply embedded in everyday life that many people could no longer imagine a world without it. The forces that threatened railway networks did not arrive all at once. They accumulated gradually. A new highway opened. A trucking company offered greater flexibility. A mine produced less ore than it once had. A forest yielded fewer harvests. A commodity price fell. A factory closed. Individually, these developments appeared manageable. Together, they began reshaping the economics that had justified entire transportation systems. The railway had originally emerged to solve a specific industrial problem, moving enormous quantities of material across difficult terrain at a cost no alternative could match. For a long time, it performed that role extraordinarily well, but industrial systems are built around economic realities, not nostalgia. When those realities change, infrastructure can lose its purposes faster than anyone expects. Road transportation became one of the greatest challenges. Unlike railways, trucks did not require fixed tracks. They could change routes, serve smaller destinations, adapt quickly to shifting demand. For many industries, flexibility became increasingly valuable. The railway remained efficient for large-scale freight movements. But efficiency alone was no longer enough. The world that railways had helped create was becoming more mobile, more complex, and more decentralized. Competition intensified. Some railway operators modernized, others consolidated. Many abandoned unprofitable routes. What had once been essential corridors suddenly became financial liabilities. And because countless communities depended upon those corridors, the consequences spread far beyond transportation itself. The pattern repeated again and again. A rail line lost traffic, service declined, employment fell. Businesses struggled, population decreased, investment disappeared. The local economy weakened. Sometimes the decline unfolded slowly over decades. Sometimes it happened with startling speed. Intertowns that had existed because of rail access discovered that their reason for existence had vanished. The mines closed. The mills shut down. The freight stopped moving, and once movement stopped, much of the economic system surrounding it began to unravel. This was especially visible in resource extraction regions. Many railway networks had been built for a single purpose: to move a specific commodity: coal, timber, ore, nitrate, agricultural products. As long as those industries remained profitable, the railway remained valuable. When production declined, the transportation system lost its foundation. The relationship that had once created prosperity now accelerated collapse. Tracks that had carried wealth outward carried less cargo each year. Stations became quieter. Maintenance budgets shrank. Infrastructure deteriorated. Eventually, some lines closed entirely. The closures often felt final because they were. Removing a railway is easier than rebuilding one. Once the rails disappeared, the economic geography that had developed around them rarely returned. Communities adapted if they could. Others faded. Some vanished almost completely. Today, their remains are scattered across the industrial world. Abandoned depots standing beside empty rights-of-way. Rusting locomotives left where operations ended. Workshops slowly collapsing beneath weather and time. Company housing surviving long after the industries that created it disappeared. These places are often described as ruins. In a physical sense, that is true. But they are also records. Industrial archaeology preserved in steel, timber, stone, and concrete. Each abandoned railway tells a story about a problem society once considered urgent, a problem significant enough to justify enormous investments of money, labor, and human effort. The tracks reveal what industries valued. The stations reveal how systems operated. The surviving communities reveal who carried the burden. And in many cases, the burden extended across generations. Because the legacy of railway networks cannot be measured solely through infrastructure. Their deeper legacy lies in the landscapes and societies they transformed. Many modern cities owe part of their growth to railway development. Industrial regions emerged because transportation made large-scale production possible. Ports expanded because railways connected them to resource frontiers. National economies became integrated through transportation corridors. The modern world still reflects decisions made during the railway age. Yet, another legacy remains less visible. The lesson that industrial systems always involve trade-offs. Every solution creates new dependencies. Every innovation produces unintended consequences. Every infrastructure project redistributes opportunity and risk. The railway solved the problem of distance. In doing so, it created communities dependent upon movement. It generated wealth on extraordinary scales. It also concentrated power in ways many workers could not escape. It connected isolated regions to global markets. It exposed those same regions to forces beyond their control. The contradiction existed from the beginning. It simply became easier to see once growth ended. And perhaps that is why abandoned railway networks continue to fascinate people today. They are not merely relics of transportation history. They are physical reminders of how industrial civilization functions. A society encounters a problem. It builds a system to solve it. The system expands. People reorganize their lives around it. Success creates dependence. Dependence creates vulnerability. Eventually, conditions change. The system declines. The consequences remain. The rails may disappear. The communities may shrink. The industries may collapse. But the marks left behind endure. Walk along an abandoned railway today, and the silence can feel deceptive. The tracks may be gone. The trains may have stopped running generations ago. Nature may be reclaiming the landscape. Yet beneath that silence lies the memory of movement. Millions of tons of freight. Countless journeys. Entire economies in motion. And behind all of it, the labor of people whose names rarely appeared in official histories. Workers who maintained the tracks. Workers who operated the trains. Workers who built lives along transportation corridors stretching across impossible landscapes. The railway helped build empires. That much is undeniable. But its most enduring story is not about steel, locomotives, or engineering. It is about the people who became part of the system, people who carried its burdens, people who enabled its successes, people who paid its costs, and whose lives remain hidden beneath the rusting remnants of the network they helped create. When we look at those forgotten tracks today, we are not simply looking at abandoned infrastructure. We are looking at the remains of an industrial world that reshaped continents, transformed economies, and bound generations of workers to a system far larger than themselves. That is the true legacy of the hidden rail network. Not the trains, not the tracks, but the lives forged along them.